Before the world rushed west with shovels and dreams, California was silent, its rivers whispering beneath the sun. Then, one morning, a glint in the water changed everything. That single shimmer would awaken a fever, pulling people from every corner of the earth, all chasing the promise of fortune, and perhaps of themselves. Tonight, we travel back to the gold rush, to the dream that built a nation, and the silence it left behind. If you enjoy gentle storytelling that helps you learn and drift into calm, please remember to subscribe for more journeys like this one. So before the shouting and the storms, before the steamboats and the songs, California was quiet. The year was 1848. The hills were wild and green after winter rain. Tall pines stood still under a wide, untouched sky, and rivers ran cold and clear through canyons of stone. The land was full of silence, a silence that wasn't empty but alive. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind carried the smell of earth, pine resin, and faraway salt from the ocean. It was in this stillness, on an ordinary morning, that the world's great fever began. At the edge of the American River, near a place called Coloma, a carpenter named James Marshall worked for a man named John Sutter. They were building a sawmill, a practical, unremarkable thing, a project meant to cut timber for the growing settlement downstream. Marshall was a quiet man, thin, observant, more comfortable with wood than with people. He had come west to make a living, not a legend. That morning, the sun had just climbed over the ridge. He walked down to the mill race, a narrow trench meant to guide water to the wheel. Something caught his eye, a small, bright glint among the pebbles. He bent down, pushed aside the sand, and lifted a few flakes of something heavy, yellow, and shining. They were small, smaller than the nail of his thumb, but they caught the light like stars trapped in water. He rubbed one between his fingers. It didn't tarnish. It didn't break. It was soft, warm to the touch. Gold. Marshall said later that he felt a strange calm when he realized it. Not joy, not disbelief, just a deep private certainty, as if the world had quietly shifted under his boots. He took the flakes to Sutter, who tested them with nitric acid. They didn't dissolve. Gold. Pure gold. Sutter frowned. He wasn't pleased. He had hoped to build an agricultural empire, a quiet kingdom of wheat and cattle, not a swarm of desperate men tearing the earth apart. "Don't tell anyone," Sutter said, "but secrets like rivers find their own course." The whisper began in taverns and blacksmith shops, in letters carried east by stagecoach, in the idle talk of sailors and traders. "Gold in California," someone said. "Real. Old. You can pick it out of the streams." At first it sounded like another tall tale. America had heard many. There were always rumors of easy wealth somewhere. In Florida's swamps, in Texas oil, in the mountain valleys of Mexico. But this rumor had a different weight to it. It spread not as a shout, but as a murmur. Steady, unstoppable. By autumn, newspapers had caught it. A small report appeared in the Californian, and a few months later, President James K. Polk himself confirmed it to Congress. It has been established that the mines are more extensive and valuable than was anticipated. That was all it took. The fever began. In the months that followed, the quiet California valleys filled with the noise of footsteps, tens of thousands of them, echoing from every corner of the earth, from the Atlantic coast, from Missouri, New York, Georgia, and Ohio. Men sold their farms, left their families, and began the long march west. They were farmers, teachers, merchants, doctors, men who had never held a shovel for gold in their lives. They packed wagons with dried meat, beans, and prayer books. They took letters from wives promising to wait, from children who drew pictures of the gold mountains. And they walked. The journey itself became a kind of myth, months of dust and danger, across deserts where water was worth more than gold, through the Sierra Nevada, where snow could swallow whole wagon trains. Some came by ship, around Cape Horn or through Panama, where disease killed more men than storms. But still they came. Because the dream was too bright to resist, they called themselves the 49ers, after the year the rush truly began, 1849. They were young mostly, full of hunger, not just for gold but for change, for a chance to be someone new. By the time the first wagons reached California, the landscape had already begun to shift. Tiny settlements like San Francisco swelled overnight. Where there had been a sleepy port with a few hundred residents, there was now a city of tents and timber, rowdy, muddy, alive with shouting and song. Saloons and gambling halls appeared like mushrooms after rain. Supplies sold for outrageous prices. A single egg could cost $1, a shovel 10, but no one cared. Everyone was chasing the same light, the glint of metal in moving water. In the foothills along the creeks and rivers, the first camps formed, chaotic, hopeful, and wild. At dawn, men rose and took their pans to the river. They scooped sand and gravel, swirled it in water, watching, breath held for that flash of yellow. Some found a few flakes. A few found fortunes. Most found nothing at all. But every time a man shouted "Eureka," 100 others ran toward the sound. Because maybe, just maybe, luck could be contagious. And through it all, California itself watched silently. The rivers that had flowed clear for centuries grew cloudy with silt and mud. The trees echoed with new languages: English, Spanish, Cantonese, German, French. Campfires burned on every hillside, and the smell of wood smoke drifted for miles. At night, under the same stars that had guided the Miwok and the Ohlone for generations, new dreams were being written in the dirt. Dreams made of gold dust and human breath. But not all that glittered was fortune. The early miners, the ones who arrived first, sometimes found gold lying in plain sight. They called it placer gold, loose flakes and nuggets in riverbeds. It was pure chance, a handful of the earth's oldest treasure, washed down from mountains older than memory. Yet even as they dug and panned, the gold began to thin. Every new prospector arrived a little too late. Every stream became more crowded, more fought over, and so began the next phase of the rush, the fever of invention and greed. Men began to build cradles, sluices, and rocker boxes. They formed companies, staked claims, and fought for inches of land. The rivers became battlefields of ambition. Still, there was a kind of beauty in it all, a strange, fleeting poetry. Letters from miners tell of mornings so clear that the mountains looked like blue glass, of evenings when the campfire smoke curled up into a sky so wide you could almost hear it breathe. They wrote of loneliness and laughter, of strangers becoming brothers, of believing, if only for a moment, that fortune was a matter of faith. And, though many would return home with empty hands, they carried back stories of rivers that glittered like the stars, of hope that refused to die. Looking back now, it seems impossible that the world could have changed so quickly, that a few flakes of gold could move ships, nations, and hearts. But that is the nature of discovery. It begins small, with one man, a handful of river sand, and a glint of sunlight that feels like destiny. The rest is echo. And so before the cities and the chaos, before the violence and the fortune, there was only James Marshall, kneeling beside a quiet river, his hand open, his eyes filled with wonder. The morning light caught the water, and for a moment, it seemed as though the earth itself was whispering a promise, that somewhere in the dust, there was gold enough for every dream. But dreams, like rivers, have their own currents, and once they begin to move, nothing, not even silence, can hold them back. By the winter of 1848, the secret that John Sutter tried to keep had already slipped beyond his reach. It traveled first on the wind, then in the letters of sailors, in the talk of soldiers returning from the Mexican War, and finally, in the steady rhythm of printing presses. Gold discovered in California. The words were small, just a few inches of type, but they burned like fire. In towns and farms across the United States, life had been predictable, sometimes too predictable. A man could work his whole life in the same fields, see the same seasons, owe the same debts. Then one day he'd pick up a newspaper and there it was. A promise that somewhere far to the west, men were scooping wealth out of rivers with their bare hands. It didn't matter if it was true. It mattered that it could be, and that possibility, that whisper of maybe, was enough to set the nation in motion. In the early months of 1849, something began to stir in America's bones. From Boston to New Orleans, from the Carolinas to Ohio, men began selling their farms, their shops, their futures. Wives packed trunks, children clutched maps drawn in charcoal on paper. Every conversation turned toward the same dream. What if I just went? What if it's still there? The word California began to sound less like a place and more like a destiny. They called themselves the Argonauts after the Greek sailors who sought the Golden Fleece. But history remembers them as the 49ers, a name that glows like brass even now. They came from everywhere. Farmers, carpenters, printers, teachers, some rich, most poor. Some were driven by hope, some by desperation. All of them believed that somewhere beneath the sunlit hills of a place they had never seen, their luck was waiting. The routes westward were as varied as the men who took them. Some boarded ships from New York or Boston, rounding Cape Horn at the tip of South America. A 6-month voyage across restless, roaring seas. Others sailed to Panama, crossed the fevered jungles on foot, then boarded ships northward to San Francisco. Many never made it, lost to malaria, shipwreck, or simple exhaustion. But the most iconic route was by land, the long, dry trail that cut through the heart of the continent. From Missouri and Iowa, wagon trains rolled west, creaking and groaning, under the weight of tools, barrels, and hope. Families lined up their oxen at dawn, the air filled with the smell of dust, leather, and campfire smoke. The journey could take 6 months or more. Across plains that seemed endless, through rivers that swallowed wagons whole, into mountain passes where snow fell like silence itself. There were days when men spoke of turning back, of giving up and going home. But there was no home left to go to. Everything had been sold, everything wagered on gold. So they pressed forward. Some kept journals, written by candlelight in tents or beneath wagon tarps. Their words still breathe today. We are on our way to fortune or to ruin. But, whichever it be, we will have our story to tell. Others sang songs. Rough, hopeful ballads passed from camp to camp. Songs of California gold and rivers of shining sand. They laughed at their hunger, shared bread when they had it. And when a wagon wheel broke or a companion died, they buried the loss and moved on. The trail was both grave and cradle. Along the way, the landscape itself seemed to test them. In the Nebraska plains, the wind blew so hard it flattened tents. In the deserts of Nevada, men drank water from wagon ruts. Their lips cracked with thirst. In the high passes of the Sierra Nevada, snow fell thick and white, a silence that could swallow whole caravans. Yet even in hardship, there was a strange kind of wonder. At night, travelers would look up and see a sky filled with more stars than they'd ever known existed. The same stars, they thought, that watched over the promised land. When they finally saw California, the hills rolling in sunlight, the rivers winding through forests of pine, some men wept. They said the air itself smelled like hope. But when they reached the diggings, they found another truth. The gold was there, yes, but so were thousands of others, each with the same dream, each holding the same pan, each praying to be lucky just one more day. The camps were already crowded, the easy gold already gone. Still, the fever did not break. Men arrived by the hundreds each week, and the rivers filled with laughter, shouting, and the ringing of metal against stone. Some struck gold, not much, but enough to keep them digging. Others struck nothing but mud and disappointment. But every success and every rumor of a man finding a nugget the size of a walnut sent the dream racing anew. There was no logic, only longing. Each sunrise felt like a chance. In cities back east, newspapers could hardly print fast enough. Headlines blared, "Fortunes made overnight." Men become rich while you sleep. It was a national fever, a glittering madness that crossed class and creed. Preachers called it providence. Politicians called it progress. Merchants called it opportunity. But for most, it was simpler than that. It was the chance to begin again. For some, that dream wasn't gold at all. It was freedom, from debts, from factories, from the narrowness of a life already written. California was the blank page of America, and men were eager to write their stories upon it. San Francisco became the heart of this new world. In less than 2 years, it transformed from a sleepy village into a roaring port city of tents, taverns, and noise. Ships arrived faster than they could be unloaded. Many were simply abandoned, their crews joining the rush inland. The harbor filled with ghost ships, their masts standing like a forest of bones in the fog. Every street was alive, traders shouting prices, men staggering drunk with victory or defeat, newspapers promising riches just up the river. It was chaotic, lawless, and somehow beautiful. A city built on breathless dreams. But beneath the frenzy, there was something quieter, a hum of destiny, the sound of a nation expanding westward. America itself was on the move, its restless spirit finding new ground. For every miner chasing gold, there were others chasing something softer, land, freedom, or the chance to belong to history. And though most would find neither wealth nor peace, the journey itself became part of the American soul, that endless belief that tomorrow could be brighter, that one sunrise might change everything. So the fever spread, from one spark in a riverbed to the hearts of men across an entire nation. They came from everywhere, driven by dreams they could not name. They crossed deserts and oceans, chasing a light that flickered just beyond reach. And though few ever found gold enough to weigh in their hands, they all carried a different treasure, a memory, a lesson, a small glint of something eternal. That hope itself is the richest thing a man can hold. By the time the 49ers reached California, many of them no longer looked like the men who had left home. The road had changed them. The sun had darkened their faces, the wind had carved lines around their eyes, and hunger had thinned them down to willpower alone. But when they saw the hills of California rolling under golden light, their spirits stirred again. They thought of all they'd heard, that the rivers ran with gold, that fortune lay waiting in every stream. And for a brief, shimmering moment, they believed it. The camps began as clusters of tents, patchworks of canvas and dreams. Along the rivers, the Yuba, the Feather, the American, men staked out, claims with sticks and stones, each one declaring, "This piece of earth is mine." At dawn, the camps came alive. Tin cups clattered, shovels struck gravel. Fires hissed in the morning mist. Men bent over the water, their backs arched, their eyes scanning the pan for that flicker of yellow. Some worked in pairs, some alone. Some sang softly to themselves. Old songs from home, half prayer, half rhythm. The air smelled of pine, river water, and unwashed bodies. There was laughter too, deep, ragged, unguarded. Men told stories at night of the gold they would find tomorrow. Tomorrow was always the word. Tomorrow the strike would come. Tomorrow they would be rich. Tomorrow they'd write home. But when dawn came, they would find the same cold river, the same aching muscles, and the same dream flickering just out of reach. Some struck it lucky. At first, a man might find a handful of nuggets, just enough to make him a legend for a week. In every camp there were stories, of one miner who unearthed gold the size of walnuts, of another who filled a pouch in a single day. The stories spread like wildfire, but no one ever seemed to meet. The lucky ones themselves. They were always a friend of a friend or a man from up the river. Still, hope clung to the camps like morning fog. Each strike, real or imagined, was enough to keep thousands digging. San Francisco was the closest thing to civilization. Men poured into the city to rest, to gamble away their earnings, to drink, to forget. A single room might cost more than a month's wages. Gold dust was the currency, weighed out on scales in bars and brothels. Every corner of the city buzzed. You could buy a shovel, a stake, or a song. You could lose a fortune before midnight, and when the money ran out, the men went back to the hills to dig again. The land itself began to change. What had once been quiet valleys grew raw with holes and trenches. Trees were felled, streams diverted. The soft hum of nature was replaced by the sound of hammers, saws, and shouts. California was being remade, not by design, but by desperation. The rivers ran brown with mud. Whole hillsides were torn apart in the search for flakes of metal, and yet in the evening, when the sun dipped low and the light turned soft and amber, the land still looked beautiful, like a dream seen through tired eyes. Not everyone in the camps was a miner. Cooks, traders, and blacksmiths followed the rush, realizing there was more gold in selling bread and tools than in panning rivers. A man might make a fortune simply by sharpening picks or boiling coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Some opened tents that sold whiskey, others sold hope. In the form of maps, charms, or promises, the camps became tiny cities of their own, chaotic, lawless, but full of life. By night, the glow of 100 campfires flickered against the dark mountains. Voices drifted over the hills, songs, laughter, curses, prayers. The gold rush was not a single story, but 1,000, burning all at once. For many, the loneliness was worse than the labor. Men wrote letters they could never send, to wives, to mothers, to children they missed more, with each passing day. "Dearest Sarah," one miner wrote, "I have not struck gold, but I have not lost faith. The days are long and the nights longer, but I dream each night of home." Some men spoke little, their silence heavier than their shovels. At night they lay awake, listening to the river and the distant howl of wolves, wondering if their journey had been a mistake. Among the miners, friendship formed easily, but it also broke just as fast. A man might share his bread one day and steal another's gold the next. There were no laws strong enough to hold back greed. Claims overlapped, tempers flared. A single nugget could start a fistfight, and a rumor of a new strike could empty an entire camp by dawn. Yet, amid the chaos, there was also kindness. Men helping each other build shelters, sharing tobacco, burying the dead with quiet respect. It was a rough, fragile sort of brotherhood, forged in the mud and fire of survival. As the months passed, the easy gold began to vanish. The rivers gave up fewer flakes. The pans came up lighter, but no one wanted to believe the dream was fading. They dug deeper, invented new methods, built cradles and sluices to sift the earth more efficiently. They tore through gravel, rerouted streams, and chased whispers of new fields farther into the mountains. Each new rumor drew another wave of hopeful men, until California's hills were alive with the endless rhythm of shovels. And yet, even as fortunes failed, something remarkable was taking shape. The gold rush had become more than a search for treasure. It was a vast experiment in endurance, a test of what people would do when faced with infinite possibility. The men who stayed learned to read the earth, to listen for the sound of gravel sliding, to smell the faint metallic tang in the air. After rain, they learned that the land itself had moods, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. In the evening, when work was done, they gathered around campfires. Someone would strum a banjo, someone else would tell a story about a strike up north. Laughter rolled across the hills, soft and tired, but real. They were strangers once, but the gold rush made them kin, brothers in dust, bound by the same hunger and hope. And when the firelight caught their faces, you could almost see it, that flicker of the same golden glow that had brought them all here. In those early years, the dream was still alive, but it was no longer the dream they had imagined. The gold they sought was smaller now. Flakes, dust, slivers of sunlight trapped in silt. But in its place, they found something else: resilience, companionship, and the strange peace that comes when a man realizes he has gone too far to turn back. The gold rush was no longer just a chase for fortune. It had become a way of being, a rhythm of digging, hoping, losing, and waking to try again. The land of promise had become a land of dust. And yet, in that dust, there was still a quiet kind of beauty, a shimmer, a glint, a reminder that dreams like gold are never entirely lost. By 1850, the world had heard the echo. From China to Chile, from France to Australia, from the ports of Peru to the docks of Dublin, the same word was whispered, carried by sailors, merchants, and dreamers alike. Gold. The sound of it crossed oceans. It needed no translation. California, a land that had been known only to a few explorers and native tribes, was now a magnet for humanity itself. In the span of a single year, ships from every corner of the earth crowded into San Francisco Bay. Their sails filled the horizon like ghosts of every nation. French clippers, English brigs, Chinese junks, Chilean schooners, each one heavy with passengers, light with sleep, and overflowing with hope. They came not just for gold, but for a chance to touch the dream America had promised. The dream of beginning again. The city they arrived to was barely a city at all. San Francisco, once a sleepy village of adobe huts, had become a wild, breathing organism. 1,000 tents and timber shacks, a patchwork of languages and desires. The streets were made of mud and fortune. The sound of hammers, saws, and laughter never stopped. Ships arrived faster than they could unload. Many were simply abandoned, their crews running off to the gold fields before the anchors hit bottom. Soon, the harbor itself became a graveyard of vessels, their masts rising like a forest of wooden bones. Some of these ships would later be turned into warehouses, hotels, even jails. Their names still faintly visible on the hulls, reminders of the restless world that had come chasing a rumor. Inside the city, the streets were alive with every tongue imaginable. Chinese merchants selling silk and tea, Irish dock workers unloading barrels of supplies, French bakers selling fresh bread that cost a day's wage, German brewers, Chilean cooks, African sailors, Hawaiian traders. The city was a cacophony of voices and smells, salt air, smoke, beer, and sweat. At night, oil lamps flickered through the fog and music drifted out of taverns. Violins, fiddles, accordions, and voices calling out songs from every continent. For the first time in history, California felt like the center of the world. But beyond the city and the mining camps, the meeting of cultures was less romantic. In the diggings, gold was the great divider. A man's worth was measured not by his birth, his language, or his skin, but by what he held in his pan. Yet even here, prejudice crept in like dust through canvas walls. Chinese miners who had traveled months by ship were often forced off their claims. They were admired for their discipline, but hated for their success. Latin American miners, skilled and experienced, were seen as competition, their accents used against them in rough camp justice. Native Americans, who had once called the rivers home, were pushed aside, enslaved, or worse, their lands stripped, their people decimated by disease and violence. It was a world both new and ancient, a frontier where hope and cruelty shared the same fire. Yet in small corners of the camps, you could still find humanity. In the evenings, after long days in the riverbeds, men gathered around fires, sharing food, songs, and stories. A Chinese miner might brew tea in a dented tin pot. An Irishman might sing a mournful ballad of home. A Mexican vaquero might carve a small wooden cross, handing it to a stranger as a gift of luck. They were bound, not by language, but by exhaustion, and by the knowledge that the earth owed them all nothing. As more ships arrived, the demand for goods exploded. San Francisco became a playground for merchants and opportunists. One man, Levi Strauss, began selling durable pants made of canvas and denim, a simple invention that would outlast the gold rush itself. Another, Samuel Brannan, realized that selling shovels and pans was far more reliable than digging for gold. He opened stores, spread the gold rumors even further, and became California's first millionaire. It was the perfect metaphor. The smartest fortune seekers were not the ones in the rivers, but the ones standing just beside them. And so, while the miners toiled, a new California was quietly being built. Streets were laid, banks established, newspapers printed. The first theater opened its doors, followed by schools, churches, and saloons, often in that order. It was a strange balance, civilization built on chaos. By day, men fought over claims. By night, they toasted their luck in taverns lit by whale oil. There was something almost sacred in that rhythm, a collective belief that even in madness, they were part of something larger than themselves. Still, not everyone was chasing gold with a pan. Writers and painters arrived, capturing the raw beauty of the land, the purple shadows of the Sierra, the golden haze that fell over the valleys at dusk. They saw in the chaos a kind of poetry, the birth of a new kind of America, one that was rough, flawed, but vibrant with possibility. The goldfields themselves were becoming small nations of their own. Each camp had its rules, its own form of rough democracy. Disputes were settled by miners' courts, a circle of men, a raised hand, and a vote. Sometimes justice was fair, sometimes it was fast, but even here, amid the mud and violence, you could sense a shared principle. That fairness mattered. Even at the edge of the world, it was as if the American experiment itself was being rewritten in the dust of California. In the letters that survived from those years, a pattern appears: hope, then hardship. Fortune, then failure. And always, always, a quiet pride in having been part of it. "I have not found gold," one miner wrote home, "but I have found the world. I have spoken with men from places I cannot spell, and I have seen the sun set over a land that feels like the future." It was, in truth, the world's first globalized moment. For the first time, people from nearly every nation shared one dream, one destination, one hunger, one fragile hope. And while most never became rich, they carried something home that mattered far more: stories, maps, memories of a land where the impossible once seemed close enough to touch. By the early 1850s, California was no longer a secret. It had become a mirror, reflecting all of humanity's light and shadow. In the gold camps and the growing cities, languages blended, races clashed and mingled, and from that chaos, a new kind of nation began to take shape. A place built not only on fortune, but on movement, on restlessness, on the eternal human instinct to chase the horizon. The world had come west, and though gold would one day fade from its rivers, the dream it carried, the dream of beginning again, would never wash away. The gold rush had always shimmered brightest from a distance, but up close, under the hard light of the California sun, that shine began to fade. By the mid-1850s, the easy gold was gone. The rivers, once alive with prospectors, had been stripped and scoured until they ran thick with silt. The men who stayed now dug deeper, into the earth, into their souls, into the meaning of what it all had been for. The sound of pickaxes no longer echoed with hope. It was duller now, mechanical, weary. Camps that had once buzzed with laughter grew silent, their fires cold, their tents abandoned. What was left were the stubborn ones, men too proud to quit, too haunted by the thought of returning home, empty-handed. They dug with desperation rather than faith. In those same hills, a new kind of power was rising. The small dreamers were being replaced by corporations, companies with steam engines, sluices, and high-pressure hoses that could wash away entire mountainsides in hours. The rivers turned gray. Forests disappeared. The once gentle valleys became graveyards of mud. Nature was no longer a partner in the search. It had become a casualty, and the gold that once seemed to bring freedom now began to bring ruin to the land and to the people who had staked their lives upon it. Crime crept in like a slow, cold fog. Men who had come seeking fortune now sought survival. Robbery, gambling, and murder became as common as mining. In San Francisco, the streets filled with drifters and thieves. Bars overflowed with men too tired to dream. The same city that had once glittered like a promise now burned with the fever of excess. The vigilance committees, groups of self-appointed citizens, took justice into their own hands. Trials were short, punishments swift. A rope hung permanently in the plaza, a grim warning that law had lost its shape in the wild rush of greed. And yet, even among the violence, there were moments of quiet humanity. Letters home spoke of loneliness more than lawlessness. "It is not the gold that haunts me," one man wrote. "It is the silence. I have not heard the voice of a woman in 3 months, nor the laughter of a child. The hills are full of ghosts, not the kind that frighten, but the kind that remember." The ghosts he wrote of were not all in his imagination. Across California, the native peoples, who had lived along these rivers for centuries, were being driven out, enslaved, or slaughtered. The gold that brought men from across the world brought death to those who had been here all along. Villages were burned, rivers poisoned, whole cultures erased beneath the roar of the hydraulic hoses. Few of the miners saw it clearly then. They were too busy chasing dust, but history would remember. The gold that built cities was paid for with silence. The silence of the land and the silence of the people it once nourished. Some miners tried to leave, to go home, but home had changed too. The letters they sent were often returned, unopened. Families had given up hope, and so many drifted, from one claim to another, from one rumor to the next. They were no longer prospectors. They were wanderers in a land that no longer wanted them. In the saloons of San Francisco, men told their stories to anyone who would listen. One said he had found gold but lost his brother to fever. Another said he struck it rich, only to lose it all at cards in a single night. Each story ended the same way, with a pause, a sigh, and the soft rattle of coins in a pocket that would never be full again. Among the ruins of the rush, a strange transformation began. Some of those who stayed stopped digging altogether. They built farms, planted vineyards, or opened small shops. The fever had burned out, but something gentler had taken its place. California was growing up. The same men who once chased fortune through rivers of mud now built towns, churches, and schools. Their gold, it turned out, had always been in the soil, just not the kind they had imagined. But for others, the fever never really left. Even in their old age, they would speak of the glint in the pan, the heartbeat that quickened at the sight of yellow. Some carried tiny vials of gold dust around their necks until they died, not for wealth, but for memory. It was proof that once, if only for a moment, they had touched the dream. There were women, too, often forgotten in the telling, but vital to the life that followed. Wives who followed husbands across oceans. Widows who opened boarding houses and made fortunes of their own. Women who washed, cooked, nursed, and endured in a world that was never made for them. They brought light into the camps, and sometimes stability into the chaos. Their names were rarely written down, but their presence softened the edges of a brutal time. And what of those who had watched it all, the shopkeepers, the priests, the few who kept journals? They wrote that the gold did not vanish. It merely changed form. It became cities, roads, dreams. The fortune in the ground had been finite, but the fortune in people, their energy, their imagination, their restlessness, was inexhaustible. By the end of the 1850s, the rush was over. The camps lay silent, the rivers scarred, the hills stripped bare. But out of that silence, something new began to stir. California had been broken open by greed, by hope, by human hands. And in the cracks left behind, a nation found its reflection. The gold rush had shown the world not only what people could build, but what they could destroy. And perhaps in that contrast lay its truest lesson, that every glittering dream casts a shadow, and that sometimes the richest thing a person can find is the strength to walk away. When the last pans fell silent, California did not return to what it had been. The hills were scarred, the rivers changed, the forests thinned, but something new had taken root. From the ruins of the rush, a civilization began to rise. The miners, who stayed, those weathered, half-forgotten dreamers, laid down their tools and picked up something steadier. They became farmers, merchants, carpenters. They built homes where once there had been only tents. They planted vines in the same soil they had once sifted for gold, and found, to their quiet surprise, that it yielded a different kind of treasure. Wine, wheat, fruit, these became California's new riches. The rush for gold had turned, almost without notice, into a rush for life. In the cities, the story was different, but no less miraculous. San Francisco, that mad tangle of mud and sails, grew into a true metropolis. Wooden shacks became brick buildings. The sound of saws was replaced by the ring of church bells, and the laughter of children echoing down steep hills. Men who had once fought over dust now opened banks, railroads, and newspapers. Many had failed in mining, but succeeded in everything that came after. The gold rush had taught them how to dream audaciously and how to endure when those dreams broke. The wealth of the land flowed outward, spreading across the nation like sunlight. Railroads reached westward, pulling the rest of America closer. Telegraph lines followed. Voices carried through copper wires where once only wind had spoken. California became not the end of the road, but the beginning of a new one. The myth of the frontier, of the restless American spirit, had found its final chapter in gold, and from it grew a country that believed, perhaps too deeply, in the promise that tomorrow could be brighter. Yet for all its transformation, the gold rush never truly ended. It lived on in stories, told by old men by the fireside, by travelers, crossing the Sierra by poets and painters who sought to capture its strange beauty. In these tales, the gold rush became less a memory and more a mirror, reflecting the human heart, our greed, our hope, our loneliness. Our ability to begin again. One man, decades later, would stand on the same riverbank where it had all begun, at Sutter's mill, and listen to the water whisper over stones. There was no gold left, only the gentle sound of time passing. He would kneel, scoop up a handful of river water, and watch it shimmer in the light. And in that reflection, he would see not failure, but legacy. The quiet understanding that every generation must have its own kind of gold to seek. There were other legacies too, less visible, but no less powerful. The rush had drawn people from every corner of the world, and in doing so, it changed the American story forever. Cultures that had once seemed oceans apart now lived side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, but always in connection. California became a mosaic, its languages, foods, and traditions woven from every continent. In its diversity, America saw its own reflection, messy, loud, beautiful, and alive. There was another inheritance, the enduring myth of fortune. Long after the last nugget was found, Americans still dreamed of striking rich, not just in mines but in business invention. In the gold rush had written into the country's DNA a deep and restless optimism, the belief that somewhere, somehow, something better waited just over the next ridge. It was both a blessing and a curse. That dream would drive railroads and industries, cities, and empires, but it would also leave behind a trail of dust and longing in every century that followed. In the quiet towns that dotted the old gold fields, the earth began to heal. Grass grew over the mine shafts, rivers cleared. Children played where men had once panned. A few rusted tools remained, half buried in soil, their edges dulled by rain. If you held one in your hand, you could almost feel it hum, a faint echo of all the dreams it had carried. And what of the dreamers themselves? Some returned home carrying little more than stories. Others never left, their graves now hidden beneath the pines. But together they became part of something larger, the American myth of becoming. They had failed, perhaps, in finding gold, but they had succeeded in something more profound. They had expanded the imagination of a people. They had proven that the unknown was not something to fear, but something to seek. If you visit California's gold country today, the rivers still murmur. The wind still moves through the grass with that same golden shimmer. You might stand there in the fading light and imagine the ghosts of men and women who once believed the earth itself could grant them happiness. And you might realize, as they never fully did, that the gold they sought was never just metal. It was meaning. It was movement. It was the promise that life could change, that something shining might still lie ahead, if only you had the courage to search. The gold rush ended more than a century ago, but its light, soft and eternal, still lingers in the American heart, a quiet gleam beneath the dust reminding us that dreams, however fleeting, are what make the world go forward. History ends, but stories never do. The gold rush, that wild, glittering fever of the 1800s, is long gone from the rivers of California. But listen closely, and you can still hear it. It hums in the silence of the hills. It flickers in the way sunlight touches the water. It lives quietly in every dreamer who still believes in a brighter tomorrow. The gold rush began as a search for fortune, but what it truly uncovered was the human soul. Restless, daring, flawed, and endlessly hopeful. Every man and woman who crossed a continent for a chance at luck was chasing something deeper than metal. They were chasing transformation. They wanted to become someone else, someone better, someone who could look back at their life and say, "I tried." And that, in many ways, is the heartbeat of America itself. America has always been a land of seekers, of those who look at the horizon and say, "There's more out there." From the Puritans who crossed the Atlantic, to the pioneers who crossed the plains, to the miners who crossed the mountains, the story never changes. It's the story of movement, of risk, of waking each day with both fear and hope in your hands. And though gold no longer draws men to rivers, the dream remains. In startups and skyscrapers, in art, music, invention, and the quiet determination to make something from nothing. The Gold Rush did not just build cities, it built belief. Belief that a single person's courage could change the course of their life. Belief that fortune could favor anyone if they just worked hard enough. It was not always true, and often cruel in its deception, but the belief itself was powerful. It gave rise to what we now call the American dream. A dream that says, you can begin again, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. But beneath that dream there has always been a shadow. The same rush that built fortunes also left destruction. The same freedom that called men west pushed others from their homes. The gold rush reminds us that progress always comes at a price. For every city that rose, a forest fell. For every fortune made, a heart was broken. And yet, even knowing that, people still chase the dream. Perhaps because we must, perhaps because in the searching itself, we find purpose, gentle tone shift, philosophical reflection. If you think about it, gold was never truly the point. It was just a mirror, a small, shimmering reflection of human desire. What people sought in those rivers was not wealth, but meaning. They wanted proof that the world was alive, that luck existed, that their choices mattered, that something beautiful could still be found in the dirt. And in that sense, every one of us is still a miner. We sift through our days, searching for glimmers, moments of joy, connection, and light. Today, our gold looks different. It glows on screens, in bank accounts, in dreams of fame or love or recognition. But the rhythm is the same. We dig, we hope, we tire. We begin again. And perhaps that's what the gold rush really gave us. Not fortune, but the faith that the act of seeking is itself a kind of treasure, soft, cinematic imagery. If you were to stand now at Sutter's mill, where it all began, you'd see little more than a quiet river flowing as it always has. The wind moves through the grass, birds glide above the water. The earth hums with a patience that human history can never quite match. And somewhere, deep beneath that riverbed, there are still traces of gold. Not enough to change a life, just enough to remind us that some things never fully disappear. The gold rush was not just an event. It was a feeling, a pulse that still beats softly in the American imagination. It taught the world that hope could be contagious, that failure could be noble, and that dreams, no matter how impossible, were worth the risk of the journey. It's Legacy is not written in coins or mines, but in the countless acts of courage it inspired afterward. Every pioneer, every builder, every artist, they all carry the same glint in their eyes that once sparkled in the rivers of California. Quiet. Conclusion, soothing and timeless. And maybe that's why the story of the gold rush still feels so strangely comforting, because it reminds us that even the most restless hearts are capable of building something lasting. That even failure can leave behind beauty. That every search, no matter how desperate, brings us closer to understanding who we are. The gold rush was, at its heart, a dream of light, born from darkness, sustained by hope, and kept alive by memory. It was never about the gold. It was about the glow, the shimmer that appears when sunlight touches water, the glint of possibility in a tired eye, the quiet courage to keep digging, even when the pan comes up empty. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the sound of the river. Soft, endless, flowing toward the sea. Somewhere in that sound is the heartbeat of 1,000 dreamers, men and women who once believed they could hold the future in their hands. And perhaps, in a way they never knew, they did. For they left behind not just gold, but a light that still shines in every person who dares to dream, who dares to search, and who dares even now to hope.